Welcome to the lecture on applied spirituality and sustainable development policy towards an integral approach. All of these terms will become quite clear as we proceed. So in this lecture, I want to tackle a few issues. We all know about lifestyle for the environment, which has been articulated by the Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji. I'll talk a little bit about sustainable livelihoods. How is it that one can reduce poverty and conserve environment at the same time? The sustainable development goals are now very well known, but are we going to get there? And so that leads us to talk a bit about applied spirituality. How is it that we might utilize inner knowing to work with the challenges of sustainable development? And finally, how to bring it all together. So just to recap a little bit about the LIFE program, as you know, it's about environmentally sustainable and responsible choices from individual to national to global level. It includes cleaner, greener, bluer future and climate leadership, which is becoming critical, some say, to the survival of humanity. That implies that we need to have more mindful, deliberate utilization instead of mindless and destructive consumption, which we continue to do as though there was no tomorrow. How we eat needs to include how we waste. 50% of the waste in this country is from wet waste, which means food waste. And so we need to move towards conscious food systems, and the Alliance for Conscious Food Systems of the United Nations Development Program is a good example of food, agriculture, and conscious practitioners. One way of dealing with poverty, for example, just to illustrate how is it that we might work with sustainability in all aspects of our programming, one approach is to start not with what people need so much, and that is people living in poverty, but to start with what they have. And so we start with what we might call an assets mapping, starting with what the people who live in poverty have, that little that they have. One might start with that rather than with needs. You see, when you start with needs and the hidden script is you need, I have, I will give to you, you begin to create a dependency syndrome. So we are looking at how you shift that. After doing the assets mapping, you facilitate a vision of what the community sees as more sustainable livelihoods, and they themselves will generate indicators for measuring the change. People then define what they can do on their own, and only then what help they need from outsiders, whether that's government or NGOs or international organization. And we find that the needs that people have, which are not to be neglected, can be policy, governance, investment, or technology. It need not be only money. So this kind of approach takes both a bottom-up and a top-down approach, and so it includes what we call macro-micro linkages. So we want to understand how is it that the macro policy level influences the way people make their living at the local level, and vice versa, how the reality of those livelihoods must be taken into policy. And so you can see it draws from Sarvodaya, Progress for All, Swadeshi, Domestic Reliance, and Gram Swaraj or Village Rule. Now, what about our sustainable development goals? Where are we? I am come to the pessimistic conclusion that we are not likely to achieve many of the SDGs by 2030, and therefore some work will have to continue. But what will be important for us is that we should learn some lessons and then try and do better subsequent to 2030. Few of us, I believe, have recognized the need for progress on an inner development journey. I have reflected after 30 years of working on sustainable development challenges. from the time of the Brundtland Commission report through the climate change negotiations and Rio, and going forward through the MDGs to the SDGs. And reflecting on all of this, I have come to the conclusion that while we have attempted to make change outside of ourselves through economics, technology, and so on, we have been neglecting our own inner development, and so I think we have not made as much progress as we should. So I'm arguing in this talk for walking on two legs, so to speak. That is to say, both the inner and the outer development. This, I believe, will be the new frontier between now and 2030 and post 2030 in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. One of my bosses in the United Nations Development Program, Gus Pett, some time ago put it really well when he said, I used to think that the top environmental problems were ecosystem damage, climate change, and species extinction, and so on. And he says that he thought that with 30 years of good science, we would be able to solve these problems. But he concluded I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual revolution. But we scientists don't know how to do that. And that's the argument in this paper, that in addition to science, technology, and so on, we need this inner, both inner of society, or what is called culture, and inner of humans, what is called spirituality. The first point that one recognizes as you approach understanding your own spiritual nature and how this links to sustainable development is the recognition of separation as false. Human beings are not separate from each other, or are they separate from nature? We share a common consciousness, and that connects all human beings, both to ourselves and to nature. But somehow, along the way of material development, we have forgotten that. So we live now in an extractive and exploitative civilization which is based on fossil fuel driven capitalism. The dominant civilizational ethic is progress and success based on more and more material accumulation. This narrative at its very core has to be changed. Otherwise, I'm afraid we will never be able to achieve the SDGs, never mind 2030. So the big challenge we need to face is that most public policy and interventional programs start from the premise that this separation, that is to say, you are separate from me, and so I will do all I can to maximize my wealth, no need to care about you. In other words, we don't have the compassion that we should be having in this society in which we live. And we, with that separation both from each other and from nature, is how we proceed and then try to reconcile society and nature. That leads us to ask rather superficial questions. We deal more with symptoms like overconsumption, pollution, species extinction. These are not the core problem, but we take it to be the core problem. They are symptoms of the core problem, which is the way we behave. So it's not about environmental management as it is about self-management. It's about how we manage ourselves. So we end up asking questions like, how do I become spiritual? What is the best path? Well, you do not have to become spiritual because you are inherently spiritual. First, all you need to do is to clear away the veil of ignorance and darkness, as the sages will say, and spirituality will come shining through. And that's what we need to do as humans, and that will help us to identify and to take the kinds of action we need to take. So one might ask then, how do we get to understand our true nature? How is it that that's possible? Well, the easiest way, as advocated by the sages like Ramana Maharshi, Sri Nisargadatta, Papaji, and so on, and that's articulated in Advaita Vedanta and the ancient Indian traditions, is to check yourself as to what you are not. Quickly, you will find, and the yogis refer to this in Sanskrit as neti, neti, not this, not that. You find you are not your mind. If you were your mind, how is it that you are able to say my mind? Who is it that is saying this? Or my body? There must be some inner something, or so we might think. But you go ahead checking, I'm not my mind, my thoughts, my feelings, and then after a while you come to the point of almost nothing, because you cannot really identify who you are. But at that point something very interesting will happen. When you come to the point that you are nothing, it is really no thing, you are not a thing. And then it occurs that you are everything in a way. You are that pure consciousness. The yogis call it you tat tvamasi. You are that. You are Brahman, or Sit Chat, Sat Chit Ananda, truth, consciousness, bliss. And there are various ways of interpreting it. But really no words can really interpret what happens then. It's just a deep underlying experience that you will come to through your meditation processes and through self-inquiry. Now, why is it important, or how can we be sure that we are getting to the core of our true nature? Well, we can be quite sure that we are, because if you look at all of the world's wisdom traditions, whether this be Advaita Vedanta, Buddhism, Taoism, Christian mysticism, Sufism, the mystical core of Islam, and so on, they lead you to that same place. And when you look at modern neuroscience from researchers like Don Huffman and others, or you look at the brain sciences and the left hemisphere, right hemisphere studies, or quantum physics, or complexity theory, all modern scientific research are beginning to point in the same direction. And that is why I think we can all be confident that we know this for sure. When you do come to this understanding, then of course you need to be the change that you want to see, the famous quotation from Mahatma Gandhi. But it doesn't become too difficult anymore, because this non-dual understanding of who you truly are leads to the idea of oneness. Oneness with each other and oneness with nature. The fiction or the delusion of separation is revealed so clearly to be false that there will be no mistaking it. This is not at all to deny our individuality in the mind-body world in which we live. In the material world, clearly we are individuals and we carry on with our daily business. But we become so clear and so immersed in the oneness, in the underlying oneness, that this non-dual nature of reality shines through. This deep understanding, the question then is does it really have to be just personal? Does it have to remain at the individual nature, at the individual level, or can it now be translated into policy making, into political action? And so the question is, why not? And if this is doable, where else than in India should this be done? So what happens then in being the change is that the ego that you have been taking to be yourself, that imaginary ego which leads selfish action, just material accumulation for more and more for yourself, that ego, which is still the dominant driver in most of humanity, will be revealed to be false, and we will then really have the social ecological connection that we seek to make from the outside. Now, how do we begin to link this to public policy? One of the ways of doing this is to understand the different kinds of intelligences that we have, starting with the most common, which is the material-based intelligence or rational thinking, which, as we all know, leads to rational intelligence or the IQ, intelligence quotient. Now, that was the dominant form of intelligence that we assumed humans to have until we discovered, and people like Daniel Goleman and so on articulated, emotional quotient, emotional intelligence, measuring social capital. How is it that we relate to each other? There are examples of people who had low IQ but high IQ and were very successful as political leaders and leaders of business and so on because of their ability to connect to people. Now, those two are well established, IQ and EQ, material capital and social capital. Now, along the same lines, we are investigating spiritual intelligence, spiritual capital, and the spiritual quotient, SQ. And just along these lines, just as the others have been mentioned or measured already, we are developing instruments to be able to measure spiritual capital and then to be able to make links to public policy in the same way that we have used the others already. So, what would be the public policy implications? Once we have this deep understanding and we bring it to the fore, we will recognize right away that the first big shift that we must make is the default purpose of public policy, which so far we have been measuring as GDP per capita. So, public policy essentially has been is driven by external economic growth and external economic development. External. Even when we look at human development, we focus largely on external features. So, if we were to ask the question, going beyond GDP per capita, to ask the question, what would public policy look like if the goal was greater love in the society, greater harmony, inner development, compassion? Would such a world not indeed be perhaps an even more beautiful world than we have now? And why is it that public policy cannot support these kinds of goals? I think the time has come and public policy can do it, but we have to recognize it and begin to work on it. The next big shift will be from ethical public policy. So, one might assume that what we are discussing is just ethical public policy, but no, this goes beyond traditional ethical public policy because it shifts from utilitarian ethics, the ethics of who should have what and how, or deontological ethics, the ethics of moral right and wrong, to ontological ethics as articulated by Swami Vivekananda and others, that is to say, the ethics of being or policies in support of life systems. The third big shift is in political economy, which must shift from the politics of having. You know, all political economy has studied so far is who get what's how. So, we are arguing that it must now shift to the politics of being. After all, we don't call ourselves human havings, do we? Yet we spend our lives, it seems, all the time on having more and more or doing more and more. And we are not human doings either. We call ourselves human beings. But somehow the political economy of our world is not yet there. And that's the next shift. Another public policy implication, a critically important one, is leadership and public management shifting from the dominant transactional mode, this more economistic, if you like, mode of management, to a more transformational mode, based on principles of authentic servant leadership, spiritual leadership, and participatory leadership styles. And I'll spend a little time a little later on in this talk looking at what and how can this leadership become a reality. But as part of the public policy shifts, the concrete shifts that must now take place are the institutions or the rules of the game. And these must shift from the design of institutions based on confrontation and competition to underlying incentives to cooperation, adaptation, and learning, from playing games to win to playing games to continue to play. And that's a kind of a subtle shift, because all our game theory at the moment seems to be focused on win or lose games. And finally, about power, because power is at the source of politics and of policy. And so the shift from power as a zero-sum game to power as a positive-sum game becomes critically important. So we will continue in part 2 of this talk in a moment. I will hope that you will join me as we do part 2 in a few minutes.